Because what often happens is that there are these bad actors, often children themselves, who have been kind of trained in how to both groom and exploit young people, not only into hatred, but into self harm. It doesn't look like the kind of hate or extremism that folks of our generation tend to recognize. Instead, it's a lot more subtle. It looks like a game, or maybe even an image of SpongeBob, or another kind of meme that's meant to be funny and sarcastic and a little bit irreverent. And it's only somewhat gradually that the violence, that the hatred really comes into play.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining me as we confront the hate and find the hope. If you like what we're doing here, be sure to hit like, subscribe, and share. My guest today is Dr. Amy Cooter, who is an expert in extremism. Her early work involved right wing militias. More recently, she has focused on the hate that is stalking our children, sometimes even leading to school shootings. Dr. Amy Cooter is one of the founders of the Institute for Countering Digital Extremism, and she has carefully followed the Antioch High School shooter's digital trail.
Whether that person knew exactly what he was planning and for what date, I don't know, but I think there were several people in his ear saying, yes, commit some violence, commit some attack. This is a good thing.
Solomon Henderson, they believe, had become ensnared in a dark web known as nihilistic violent extremism, a network of various groups, some with neo-Nazi connections, groups like the Maniacs Murder Cult, Order of Nine Angles, and No Lives Matter. They target kids in online spaces, some as young as elementary school, hoping to get control of their minds and make them do their bidding. Dr. Amy Cooter, thank you for joining me. Some parents will be listening to this and say, my kid is not into hate or extremism. This is just not something that I feel like I have to worry about. What's your response to that?
As a parent myself, I think that's a very normal and in some ways healthy reaction. But unfortunately, it doesn't match the reality of what we are seeing with this kind of extremism online. Because what often happens is that there are these bad actors, often children themselves, who have been kind of trained in how to both groom and exploit young people, not only into hatred, but into self harm. So, what we've seen in practice is that many of the first steps toward what we're calling nihilistic violent extremism and some of these online communities doesn't include a swastika. It doesn't look like the kind of hate or extremism that folks of our generation tend to recognize. Instead, it's a lot more subtle. It looks like a game, or maybe even an image of SpongeBob, or another kind of meme that's meant to be funny and sarcastic and a little bit irreverent. And it's only somewhat gradually that the violence, that the hatred really comes into play.
Let's talk about that term, nihilistic violent extremism. We don't want to get too far in the weeds on that, but in general, what does that mean? What are we talking about?
Yeah, it is like you say, it's kind of one of those clunky academic terms, but in practice, we're talking about an ecosystem online, and unfortunately, it's global, of primarily young people who feel kind of out of place at home, at school, in society at large. And then they get into these online communities that exploit that feeling and make it feel bigger. They kind of convince these kids that there's nothing that's worthwhile, everything is kind of pointless, that life has no value. And if you start to internalize that, especially as a child, it becomes a lot easier then to embrace violence, embrace dehumanization, and maybe move toward harming yourself or harming other people.
And what is the goal? What's the end goal that these perpetrators are trying to achieve?
Fundamentally, something that undergirds this kind of extremism is another clunky term called accelerationism. And what that means is that some individuals believe if they sow social chaos, it's going to bring about the end of society as we know it. And I know, again, from a parental perspective, that sounds kind of crazy. But realistically, what happens is their goal is to target children, corrupt them, make them be desensitized to gore, sometimes to pornographic and child sexual abuse materials, and warp their minds, turn them into people that they believe will not be able to function in society as we define it. And so their goal is really to corrupt as many kids as they can in as many harmful ways as they can to disrupt society for everyone.
And who are the perpetrators? I mean, because this just sounds evil on its face. Who's doing this?
Yeah, unfortunately, most of the perpetrators are themselves children. The average age range that we see online, both for victims and perpetrators, is between 12 and 17 years old. And again, that sounds so far out there. That we'd like to believe that it's very rare that kids in our community aren't doing those things. But unfortunately, the networks are set up to be self-serving so that once you fall into them, you're very rapidly groomed in many cases in techniques for doing this kind of thing to others and to perpetuating this kind of treatment. And so, unfortunately, it kind of takes hold all on its own once it's begun.
And so this happens in what sort of forms? How does it begin?
One of the most common origination points we see is Roblox, which is a site made for kids that many parents assume has to be safe because it's made for kids.
It begins in the world of online games.
Is they're playing a game on Roblox. They're approached potentially to then carry their chat into a different space.
But what began as fun can quickly take a dark turn, where children are manipulated into hurting others, perhaps even hurting themselves.
And unfortunately, what happens is there's kind of a pro-social relationship made. People make friends and they start talking about a game. And then a couple of different things can happen. Either the kids are kind of tested for their proclivity towards gore or violence, or perhaps they're then kind of extorted. They're talked into giving something about themselves or their family, their name, their address, their phone number. And then these individuals start saying things like, well, if you don't send me naked pictures of yourself, or if you don't carve your name into your, or carve my name into your arm, then I'm going to show up at your house and do something bad to you, or something along those lines. And very frequently, we've seen people follow through with some of those threats, just enough that it coerces kids, especially kids who don't necessarily think about longer term consequences, into complying. And many of these conversations happen not just outwardly on Roblox, but on spaces like Discord or even private messaging on other apps, because these individuals are very good at quickly saying, we could talk more easily off of this platform, or we could talk more easily in this way on another channel. And so it happens across platforms in a way that can be hard to monitor.
So, and I think that's a good point to emphasize here, because one of the warning signs is when when a child meets someone on Roblox and they attempt to move them to another platform. Correct?
Yep, that can be a big warning sign. So if kids are playing on Roblox, tell them things like, if you're talking to somebody who seems like a friend here, but then they're trying to get you to go to Discord or to Telegram, let's not do that and come have a conversation with me. If they have friends who try to get them to play unusually violent games or games that maybe do include a swastika or something that is a concrete symbol of hate, that can be a signal that that's somebody who's trying to groom and exploit as well.
Now, you mentioned that the perpetrators try to get details like, a parent's name or an address, perhaps. That's then used to kind of show that the perpetrator has some way to reach out to the person. I mean, talk about that. I mean, things like swatting or pizza deliveries, correct?
Yeah, things like that. We've had a lot of cases where either kids have been coerced into giving that information, or they've downloaded malware that's given the individual that information. So it's presented as something in game, but it actually installs something on their computer or on their device that then leaks their IP address or other information about that individual and their family. And then that information can be used against them. One of the common techniques in this space is what we call swatting, where individuals call and report a fake emergency to the police, hoping that the police will respond, guns drawn, maybe some will get injured, or at the very least, it will cause embarrassment and inconvenience. Sometimes it's a little bit lower level than that in terms of the immediate risk, where they do get potentially dozens of pizza deliveries all within a short span of time, which maybe at first glance for some of us almost sounds a little funny. But the reality is it's a form of intense harassment that both in that moment where those deliveries are happening and also as a message, I know exactly where you live and I can use that information against you at any time, possibly for violence, possibly for other reasons.
And so I think, again, as we go through this conversation, let's flag the warning signs for parents. If pizzas suddenly start showing up without explanation, or there's a swatting call, that could be a warning sign.
Yeah, I think that would be a late warning sign realistically because the harm is already at your door. And that's the point where you certainly need to have a serious conversation with both the child and with law enforcement. Some other signals, sometimes before you get to that point, would be other kinds of deliveries showing up at your home for the child without a lot of explanation. Increasing time spent online, which I know is a tough one for a lot of parents, especially with teenagers, but often it's paired with a good deal of anxiety or embarrassment talking about what the child is doing online, a lot of secrecy, a lot of trying to evade conversations about that. Unfortunately, one of the early signs too can be hiding one's body in different ways, which might be a sign that they're trying to hide cuts that they've made in compliance with these groups, either names of the group or individuals or certain symbols. So sometimes they'll be wearing clothing that's inappropriate for the season or avoiding going swimming or that sort of thing so that they can hide those signals at least for a while.
So the perpetrators get their hooks into a child, and through getting the child to do cuttings and sending them photos or videos, through the swatting, the pizza deliveries, or whatever. What happens next? I mean, because as you mentioned, this is very late stage. So what are your concerns about what happens next potentially?
It's often really difficult for children who reach that stage to get back out of it without external intervention. So, very often, what we see if that involvement is happening either outside of a parent's view or at a low enough level that it's a problem, but maybe law enforcement haven't been called to a swatting attempt or something along those lines, is that unfortunately these kids get deeper and deeper and deeper into this behavior. Not only are they hurting themselves, but sometimes they are groomed and exploited into hurting pets or younger siblings. In the very worst cases that we see school shootings happening because people are coerced to do violence against others, and mass violence, and especially mass violence against other young people, is especially valued in this space. On the other hand, when we do have cases where appropriately informed law enforcement are made aware that there's a problem, we see that they're able to come in and help start a recovery process. Just because law enforcement is engaged in a case like this, it doesn't mean that the child is going to be arrested. More often than not, they're really trying to support that child, their family, and get them away from the people who are hurting them. And I've seen that happen productively in many cases.
Now, you and I had talked about an incident that happened at a Nashville charter school.
And once we started to investigate that at that specific school, we saw that there was more than one kid that was involved.
Police also uncovered a drawing from the child's digital trail that described a radicalization process that starts with the child cutting himself, potentially ending with him killing himself.
They want to work these kids up to that ultimate level. Any point in there that they don't comply, they'll say, well, remember what happened last time, we swatted your house, it's going to get worse.
What 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 does that particular case tell you about this form of extremism? What did you see in that case that set off the alarm bells in your own mind?
Well, I could talk about that case for a long time, but in terms of the markers of the case itself, there were a few indications that that particular student had been heavily groomed, heavily influenced. The online materials of that case showed an interest in violence. There was participation in some online games that allow the player to pretend to be a mass shooter in other past mass shootings, for example. There were indications that this individual had been exposed to certain symbology and underlying articulations of the motives for this connected to accelerationism that not everyone who falls into this space receives. But when we see that, it usually means that they're in it pretty deep and will need extra special and prolonged attention to get back out of it. But on the other hand, I was really able to see, quite frankly, how Nashville police were prepared to deal with cases like this. Unfortunately, a lot of jurisdictions aren't. And also, unfortunately, we see jurisdictions like Nashville, like Madison, Wisconsin, who have already dealt with a school shooting connected to these spaces where they have to know some of these materials. They have to understand the risks. And unfortunately, because of those experiences, at least in part, Nashville police were really responsive and understood the risk, acted very quickly, intervened with the student and his family. And I think we've got a good chance of having a positive outcome from that one.
And so in that case, you had potentially a hacking into a school email system. Email goes out. The child is essentially doxxed as being part of this movement, and your thinking was that was an attempt to push that child over the edge.
That is my opinion, yes, based off of other cases that I have reviewed in other jurisdictions and given some of the specific language in the email. As you said, the email was presented to supposedly embarrass the student and say, look, he's part of something bad, ha ha ha. But the way it was framed, and especially the fact that it came over Christmas break last year, it seemed more likely to be an attempt to goad that individual to come back ready to act after the break. And in this space, what ready to act means is commit a school shooting. I think the person who sent the email wasn't counting on administrators or anyone else being able to recognize that there was a potential very real threat encapsulated in that material, and was hoping instead to put the student on edge and push them into action.
Is there a common denominator about the type of child who is susceptible to this sort of approach?
I really want to emphasize that there is not just one profile for this. We've seen kids who, at least on paper, very wealthy, very well off, seem like they have supportive parents who are trying to monitor their online activities, get really deep into this. Um, at the same time, there is a pattern where most cases have kids who, in some capacity, at least feel like they've experienced some sort of family trauma. Even in that on paper, everything looks good case, that child felt quite a distance from one parent in particular. And there didn't seem to be a history of actual abuse or anything, but just kind of felt lack of acceptance or something from one of those parental figures that then snowballed into a search for identity and search for community online. So there's a little bit of a parallel with that. In more cases, we see where young people who have some kind of trauma, some kind of family disruption, or in some cases, mental health issues or neurodiversity that makes them susceptible to grooming can come into play. And as the mom of an autistic child, I want to emphasize that the neurodiversity itself is not the problem, but rather it's the way these ecosystems actively exploit some of those desires for pattern seeking or concrete answers or other things that sometimes can be misinterpreted if you're not having a really actively involved parent or other adult figure kind of canceling out some of those messages.
Now, let me switch to a different approach to kids, a very, very different profile. But, again, I think a cautionary tale. I have done investigations of a neo Nazi named John Manadio.
So what I do is I'm an entertainer, pro-white entertainer. I hate I hate I hate non-whites, okay?
Live streaming from his own racist website after being repeatedly banned from mainstream platforms, the Springfield, Missouri man makes money from other white supremacists who pay to cheer him on.
Hey, what's up? How are you?
How old are you?
I'm too old to be on this, but I'm warning women like you to stay away from these filthy.
As he goes into roulette-style video chat rooms,
How old are you?
I'm 12, about to be 13.
where he often encounters children, who goes into video chat rooms where children are frequently found. Uh, he berates children of color. He berates Jewish children, and he tries to recruit white kids to join his ranks. Uh, what does that case tell you about the threats that kids face and what parents need to know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because it's a similar practice, even though it's an adult on the other end of the computer, and sometimes an adult who's not really even trying to hide his identity, as I understand it. But for me, it highlights how parents sometimes don't have some of the baseline conversations with kids about dangers on the internet. I found that many parents assume that it's common knowledge. You should not share your name. You should not share your address. You should not share your parents' occupation online, but it's not common knowledge to kids. And even having that message repeated can be an important barrier to some of this exploitation. Knowing that you are going to encounter strangers on the internet, especially in some of those video chat scenarios where you're paired with a stranger, is also an important conversation to have. Not everybody, adult or kid, either one, is going to have positive motives in that kind of interaction. And I would strongly suggest that parents at least consider only letting their kids use technologies like that under close supervision.
If if parents come away from this conversation with one takeaway, can what would that one takeaway be?
For me, I think it's proactive communication and specifically saying, the internet can be a great place for all of these reasons, but there are bad people out there. And I want you to know that if you see something, or even if maybe you do something that feels a little bad, you should be able to come talk to me as your parent, as your caretaker, as your teacher about this before it snowballs, before it gets to be too late. Because most of the cases of this I see start off with a child doing something that objectively not that serious, but is made to feel serious to them. And then they're pressured and groomed into doing worse and worse things because they feel like they can't talk to an adult. They don't have a way back out of it. Making sure that pathway is there and making sure that that love and connection is clear and present up front is probably the best prevention we have for a variety of harms.
Well, one of the things I've heard from viewers and readers of my Substack publication is don't be such a downer. Confront the hate, find the hope. Um, do you have hope at all right now about this
I
conversation?
do. I do. This is all really dark, awful stuff, but I think kids are generally smarter and more capable than we often give them credit for. And as long as we as adults are giving them information appropriately and tools that they need to be safe, I think that we're empowering them to make better decisions. I also see more adults, including parents, teachers, sometimes law enforcement, sometimes practitioners, starting to understand more about this particular kind of threat and trying to do more in their communities to help fight it.